When we look at occupational crime, we are looking at a kind of crime where people use their jobs or their businesses or their occupations to actually commit a crime. Sometimes they will create a legal entity in order to commit crime, and sometimes instead of actually creating that legal entity to commit crime, they'll take advantage of an existing legal entity to commit crime. So if you are a doctor or a doctor's office and you want to overbill the government for medical expenses through the VA office, for example, Veterans Affairs Office, that would be an example of occupational crime. As you might imagine, this term overlaps with a very common term in criminology. It was in fact invented by a criminologist called white-collar crime. The idea of the white collar comes from the 1950s, where it was associated with men in suits with white collars and black ties and black jackets. A very good example of what many people consider to be white-collar crime, but also why it's so difficult to define occupational crime, including white-collar crime, would be the question, and we emphasize question over here, of some of the business acts that took place that facilitated the 2008 financial crisis that we call the Great Recession. One of the really difficult things about occupational crime is determining when a crime has occurred and when it hasn't occurred. And we see that in an example that I'm going to ask you to pause listening to me and go and look at a couple of other videos to illustrate. In the trailer you saw from the documentary movie Inside Job, as well as in the subsequent discussion with the director of Inside Job, you heard arguments made that behind the great financial crisis of 2008, which we are still dealing with, which still shapes our economy and our society in all sorts of fundamental ways through, for example, people who lost their houses because of bankruptcy due to the mortgage crisis. We see the question of, was there a crime or not? And who gets to determine it? In practical terms, very, 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 very few, did you hear me count? Did you count those varies? There were a lot of varies over there. Very, 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 very few people have been criminally prosecuted for any financial crimes or white-collar crimes or occupational crimes that led to the 2008 financial crisis. Indeed, Attorney General Eric Holder made the comment that some of the big banks and some of the big financial institutions were too big to jail, playing on the idea that financial institutions needed to be rescued because they were too big to fail. In other words, the idea that our economy, our society, our political order could not stand the kind of fallout of really going after the people that might be responsible criminally for what happened in the financial crisis. The reality is, it wasn't just about size. It's also very difficult to charge people in many of these financial crimes. And occupational crime in general tends to be very difficult to deal with by our criminal justice system. Partly as a cause, partly as a consequence, occupational crime is even more undercounted than ordinary or visible or street crime, which we talked about before. And there are lots of reasons for that. A first is that there's tremendous vested interest in institutional secrecy by the people who work for the organizations or work for the individuals who are involved in occupational crime. People, simply put, don't want to lose their jobs by reporting their bosses or their colleagues. Secondly, and this was a big issue in the 2008 financial collapse, some of the things that some people might see as crime, other people would argue were just business practices that were intended to be shrewd and clever, although they didn't work out so well, which is why everything collapsed. It's also important to realize that it's not just what happens at the huge institutional level that occupational crime might exist. Say, for example, you go to a service station to get your car repaired, and there is deliberate overcharging of that car repair. Or you go to a dentist who tells you you've got a cavity that you actually didn't have, or fills something that actually would have been better left unfilled. To the extent that was deliberate way to procure additional money without the need for that service, whether it was your cavity or your car, you have been a victim of fraud. Chances are you will never know. Some research suggests that as much as 1 in 4 of us are affected by this kind of routine crime in our society through people committing crime through their occupations. Finally, before we moved on to our next category, I hope many of you are thinking about cybercrime as I have this conversation with you, because cybercrime is one of the most common ways occupational crime is committed in today's day and age. Whether it is somebody sending you an email claiming that you owe them money when in fact you don't, or pretending they are lost overseas and they've really hacked into your friend's account just trying to get money out of you. These could all be examples of cybercrime which often overlap with occupational crime.